three-part series. And despite the picture that's on the screen now, the takeaway I want you to be considering as we go through this is how much this applies to what I could use year-round. And I know that when I was active in listing a lot of properties, we did this private listing strategy on a strategic basis all year round. And we took a lot more listings like we'll talk about during the holiday season. But if your thought in attending this course was, well, I need to learn something to do when somebody says, I'm not ready to list now, or I don't want to be on the market over the holidays, I'm going to wait till the spring. This, as we'll talk about today and in session 2 and 3, comes up a lot more than you realize. And you're potentially, especially in low inventory markets, missing an opportunity. So when Stephanie and I are going to go through today is part 1, getting the fundamentals out of the way so that we explain the strategy, when this applies, how you adjust, and we'll do a little bit of discussion and role play at the end of a little bit of the nuances and shifts in how you talk with prospective sellers so that you can vet them or pre-qualify them as a participant in a private listing program. And we'll get into the definition of what that means a little bit further here in a few minutes. So Stephanie, anything you want to add as we get into this? I know this comes up a lot in coaching calls. There's always a discussion about this, and there's a lot of misunderstandings in terms of what agents think. Anything else you want to add before, as an intro, before I get into the specifics?
Yeah, thanks for asking, Kevin. What's our ultimate goal with our mastery clients at the end of January? What is the goal that we've given to all of our clients?
Well, we have a target of prospective listing opportunities that for our private one-on-one coaching clients, the mastery clients, of having 50 people identified that have indicated that they're going to sell after the holidays and or in the 2015 timeframe. So part of what we're going to talk about in this 3-part series here is an ability to go back, if you haven't. Some of our clients are a little bit further along than others with this, to find out if they qualify and would be a good candidate to participate in a private listing. And a private listing, just by definition, for what we're talking about, is a listing that is not on the MLS and active through traditional channels. In other words, the traditional practice is I go out, I run a listing consultation, the seller signs listing paperwork, I go back to my office and either myself or my team enters it into the MLS, and the MLS syndicates it to a number of websites. I may put it on some additional websites, including my own. There may be other syndication that goes on. So what we're discussing, specifically the private listing, is all sorts of different names. Pocket listings, non-MLS listings, listings that are MLS exempt. The private portion is the fact that it's not active on the MLS. And this is going to be a non-inconsequential difference, because what you're going to find as we talk about this is there are a lot of sellers that are highly motivated that either have, and like point 1 says here, temporary conditions that exist. During the holidays, this may be that they've got family in town and they have a whole bunch of events. If you work the luxury market, it could be that in combination with corporate events, company parties, and charity events that they're holding at their house. And what we're trying to avoid, and this is the number 1 takeaway that I want you to be thinking about, is the nonsense that occurs on a normal basis that sellers have to put up with our peers and other agents. The fact that they arrive in front of the house because they happen to be looking at property in the neighborhood and they think that they can just call up and view it with no advance notice. The fact that they can call and or not show up on appointments with advance notice. So part of what we'll be talking about in session 2 is how do you differentiate a private listing in a much more controlled manner about how much more qualified the buyer agent and the buyers will be. Because there's a benefit for a motivated seller. There will be plenty of people that will, let's just take the holidays for example, have a condition that says we cannot have the normal conditions exist because of X, Y, and Z. We're doing charity events. We have family in town. And what they're telling you is, I've sold property before. I was on the market previously. I don't want to put up with the nonsense. They probably won't bring it up, but they've all had it. You've had those seller servicing calls where they said, we rearranged everything. We ran home. We put the dogs in the crates, and buyer agent X just didn't show up, didn't bother, and canceled. They showed up an hour and a half late and didn't let us know where they're coming late. The motivated sellers, these temporary conditions may be, look, we're not going to put our entire family through this over the holidays. Or I've got this going on, we're traveling, whatever the temporary conditions are. They may or may not be a good candidate, but as we'll talk about today, this is why it works. And we'll explain to you in part 2 some of the descriptions about how you determine whether they're a good candidate for it. It's how you explain and go through what it means to be a private listing. You managing the process is a big part of this. It may be strategic, as we'll talk about today, because of low inventory. Low inventory is a huge strategic reason to have somebody go on as a private listing. One of the objections you'll hear, and we hear this from coaching client after coaching client, I've got a great seller. It's a past client that wants to move up, move down, do something, and they're unwilling to put their house on the market because they can't figure out where they're going to move. We'll talk about this at the tail end of this session 1, when Stephanie and I do a little bit of role play and objection handling about why market conditions are a huge reason that year-round you may choose to do private listings. And that was my comment at the top of this, that don't think that this is just a holiday or I want to sell in the spring strategy. This is a year-round thing if you handle it properly. And because market conditions are dynamic and change, and you have seasonality, as I talked about, and for those of you that are in listing mastery in the seasonality section, you have to adjust what you're doing. You'll do a lot more private listings over the holidays and in the winter, especially if you're in a cold, inclement market. But just be aware that low inventory is another reason that you'll do quite a bit of this. Sophisticated sellers who are motivated may give their temporary condition that they don't want to go on is the fact that they won't get caught without a property to be able to purchase. And we'll talk about this in the series here about how the low inventory market is a reason to use this strategically, and having sellers understand that this potentially buys them a lot more time than they would have otherwise. So it's a non-traditional listing program. It's them having more control and you having control of the circus that quite often occurs with buyer agents. If you look at it from a relative skill standpoint, many agents that spend their time working with buyers and don't work with listings have no concept of what it is the results are of their unprofessional activities when showing properties. Now, if you combine that with what we're talking about during periods of low inventory and the holidays, it's an intersection of trouble, especially for sellers who can be very motivated and want to get something done, but not willing to participate, especially over the holidays, in the normal circus, right? Again, it's not a big deal unless you have family and charity events and other things going on to have it occur. It's part of what you put up with when you market a listing that's in the MLS. It becomes open season on that. In a private listing, or the PLP that we're talking about here, it resonates with motivated sellers versus the non-traditional listings, especially if they were previously on the market and they're withdrawn, canceled, expired. They were previously marketed and they're like worn out from being on and dealing with people booking appointments and showing up an hour and a half late, or worn out because they had to have the house show ready and they have young children or other things in their life that keeps them from being able to be ready. So this is why the private listing resonates so well with them, because it's a different strategy. It's also a strategic differentiator because most agents don't have any concept of this, right? It's, I list your home, it goes in the MLS. And a lot of agents rush the process, which makes sellers uncomfortable. They just think that's the only way it works. In other words, I'm going to sign listing paperwork, we're going to put a sign in your yard and you'll be live tomorrow. Good, bad, or indifferent. And that's why so much poor quality listing occurs. Bad photographs, descriptions that are marginal at best. It's just, there's no reason on a year-round basis you shouldn't have some period of time where for many of your sellers, they'll appreciate the fact that there's more control going on. So the reason this occurs is sellers are misinformed about the ability to even do this. Because the average agent thinks that they got to rush things, get it on the market right away, they've never, in a lot of cases, heard about this. And so, as we'll talk about today, the objection handler and how you ask a question, how you explain a little bit, and we'll get into this and more in session 2, about what participating in a private listing program entails and whether or not they want to participate is up to them. You're going to determine whether they're even eligible by explaining how the program works. They're going to determine whether they elect to participate or not. There is a benefit in explaining to them that these even exist. It's a competitive differentiator because you're showing that you offer a breadth of services, including a private listing program, above and beyond what they typically have experienced. This is especially true for sellers who were previously on the market that thought that the only way that they could market their property was by being active in the MLS. So let's talk a little bit about how to identify and qualify private listing prospects. The best ones, and this doesn't change from a traditional listing, are motivated, in other words, must sell, not have to sell, that have a temporary condition or desire not to be active in the MLS for a period of time. Again, this is a year-round thing, but especially during the holidays. And like we said, Stephanie and I will go through and I'll explain to you how to ask a question that determines whether they're potentially, not that definitely, but they're potentially a good prospect. The condition you're going to hear is, you know what, I don't want to be on the market over the holidays. We're going to take a break. We're coming on. Call me after the holidays. Can you call me in the spring? We definitely don't want to sell now. We want to sell in the spring. They come in all sorts of different packages that virtually say the same thing. I don't want to be on the MLS and available for showing. That's usually what it comes down to. And the way you ask the question, which I'll get into a little bit later, is a qualifier as to whether they would be even a good candidate. Seasonal, fourth quarter, and holidays, there are a lot more expired withdrawn during the holiday and fourth quarter. But this is, again, like we talked about, a year-round period. In other words, don't miss out prospects. Don't miss out on prospects by overlooking the non-holiday other times a year. Because we tend to think of things as very short periods of time, right? We get past Halloween, we get into the Thanksgiving and then the holidays, Christmas and New Year's. And we look around, and after that occurs, we're in the winter, and we're like, well, what do we do now? Especially if you're in a cold, inclement climate. This is another great strategy to use all the way into the spring, but it applies all year round. I'm going to talk in session 2 about how we applied this with everyone year round. You're going to do a bunch of work to your house. You're not going to be ready for 6 weeks? Great. Does anybody talk to you about the private listing program? No. And then I would explain it. I'll talk about that in session 2 about how you do that on a year-round basis. We would not do a hard stop in the lead follow-up for people that weren't ready. Quite often, part of what we would do is we would have it listed and be privately marketing it, while some of our select contractors and vendors were doing work to help get them ready. And again, in session 2, we'll talk about how this really works on a year-round basis. Now, if you contrast that to how people approach this, and whether you want to call it an MLS exempt listing or a pocket listing, usually it's for short periods of time, and it's not part of any kind of plan or program. It's just, you know, my sellers aren't ready, or the agent has misconstrued the fact that this is something strategic for them in an attempt to double-end it. Again, just to be really, really clear, this is not about double-ending listings. For those of you that are in coaching with us or have been in listing mastery, you know from a strategic standpoint, we had a no dual agency policy for myself as the listing agent and for us as a team. In other words, I, as the listing agent, would never represent a buyer, ever. So the whole pocket listing, trying to double-end things, is not part of this strategy. In fact, we made and we discussed in our private listing program how we handle that and how another agent will be brought in to handle that should somebody in our marketing of your private listing want to purchase it. And we made that in more of a strategic item so that they understood the dynamic and what that is as far as a benefit for the agent versus the seller. So your presentation has to be customized. And you have to do this for motivation timing, what objections they have, what conditions they've given you as far as seasonality as well. In other words, you can't just say the same thing. And this is part of the challenge with the canned approach. The canned approach in many, many systems, and this has been going on for decades, is when somebody says, let's just take the holidays. I'm not interested in being in the holidays, things slow down, just call us back in the spring, is to go attack the problem by giving the benefits. And the benefits are a great laudable list of it's low inventory, motivated buyers, we've got relocation buyers, and be that as it may, all of those potentially are true. It still doesn't get to the underlying piece, which is what are the conditions and the objections that they're really giving you? What's appropriate for seasonality? And there's a different question, as I'll go through at the end of this first session, that you can ask them and then drill down on. They'll give you a better idea as to whether you need to just pursue them as a future listing or they're a potential candidate for a private listing. Because if it's not personalized to them, and it doesn't tie into their motivation and timing, all you're doing is coming across like a pushy agent and coming across with what benefits you. It's fairly intuitive to sellers because they drive around and they see there is low inventory, right? Most of the signs they saw all year long, especially during the spring and summer, are gone. There's very little for sale. So you're not instilling anything that is so earth-shattering that they're going to say, oh my God, I didn't know that it was low inventory over the holidays. And if you think about it, as ludicrous as that statement, but that's the normal traditional objection handlers. Say silly stuff to a seller and they may agree to meet with you. No, all you're doing is sounding like all of the other silly agents who say the same thing. In other words, customizing it and making it very specific to their motivation and timing, what the objections were that they gave you, what the conditions were that they gave you, and asking a different set of questions to determine either based on time of year or whatever they told you, it's appropriate. And then being really, really well-versed at understanding when to push for it, potentially, by asking another question, which we'll get into in session 2, or let it go. Better to not burn a great prospect, because if they don't answer the questions I'm going to go through at the tail end of this with the right affirmative responses, you should not be trying to go meet with them because they're not a good candidate for it. And all you're going to do is come across like you're pushy, and you're going to irritate them. And the listing process has to be adjusted. And the expectations of the seller are key. In other words, you're still going to have to pre-qualify and make sure you understand motivation timing. It still has to be priced right. You're not going to get to take overpriced listings because it's the holidays or wintertime. And adjusting the expectations of the seller, it's not being marketed the same way it is when it's fully syndicated and marketed and in the MLS. Does it mean that it can't sell? No, absolutely not. We'll get into in session 2 and some of the stuff in session 3 about how to make sure you set proper expectations from a seller servicing standpoint, from what should occur. And some of this has to be customized depending on what the hot buttons are for this particular seller. We had a fairly standardized process, and it was always tied to what they're looking to accomplish. If it's during the spring and the summer and they're getting work done, usually our contractors or people that we're helping them with were involved in the process. So the length of it and adjustments to it were relative to the work that was being done. If it was over the holidays or in the winter, we picked certain targets and we went back, as we'll talk about in session 2 and 3, and readdressed it. The seller servicing calls are a little bit different than a traditional seller servicing call like we talk about in the Advanced Listing Mastery Series. So we'll address that in the 3rd session. How do I keep people from getting frustrated? Well, one of the ways you do it is by effectively having a program that doesn't overpromise and underdeliver. So why do market conditions and seasonality matter? Well, I touched on this a little bit earlier. There are more private listing program prospects that exist in a low inventory market, and also because of seasonality in Q4, than they would in a buyer's market. And why is that the case? I touched on it earlier. I'm going to spend a little bit more time on it now. And it's because sellers, whether they'll tell you this or not, unless you ask the question correctly, a big reason that people hold off, a big reason that people will wait until the spring is because they are moving to another property, and if it's not leaving your marketplace, meaning relocating out, or they're not doing new construction where they know where they're going and there's a lead time to build it, they're concerned that, especially in low inventory markets, they're not going to have anywhere to go if their observation is listings are going up and they're going into contract with multiple offers the first weekend. One of the things you'll see if you call expirable, withdraw, and cancel listings is in a low inventory market, quite often, you'll hear from prospective sellers that you're talking to, their reason for withdrawing or canceling their listing was the fact that the level of activity, because they hired a clueless agent and they didn't set expectations, was that we were going to get caught flat-footed without someplace to move to. So we just declined every listing, including the full-price listings, and we pulled our house off the market because it scared us. So whether they're telling you this or not, this is in the back of the mind of many motivated sellers in a low inventory market. And the private listing, as we'll talk about in session 2, is a huge strategic differentiator. And we'll talk about how you use this to buy them a lot more time. Because the traditional method of just going live and then the circus of 14 offers and 27 showings and all sorts of activity, especially during the spring and summer, is not something that is seen as a positive by many sellers, unless they know where they're going. So the session 2, we'll touch on it as to how you make this something strategic, which don't miss the fact that this is not just a holiday, fourth quarter holidays over the winter strategy. This is a year-round strategy that you want to have in your available tools because it actually fits and is appropriate for many, many people. So the prospects, a lot of them are lost because they don't understand it's a strategic opportunity for them. Remember, the traditional holiday piece is tell them about low inventory, tell them about motivated buyers, and try and get them to agree to meet with you. Well, if you can't explain how it's a benefit to them strategically or an advantage to them, you're going to miss lots of opportunities. If you're doing it through a traditional mechanism and not asking a different set of questions, you're trying to give them stupid, silly, there's a low inventory and the buyers are motivated strategy, you're going to find most people will just step away from you. And you may have ruined them as a prospect for after the holidays too, because you're telling them things that they know, that they perceive is just an agent trying to convince me to list my house because they're more concerned about listing as to whether or not this is a good thing for me or not. It has to do with you being able to explain, like we'll talk about it a little bit today, but really get into in session 2. What are the strategic and other advantages to the seller? And this is why it has to be customized. It has to fit what they're trying to accomplish. So if you apply it in the wrong cases, it's like if you're in listing mastery, we talk about trying to close people to meet when they have a condition versus it was an objection and you need to overcome that objection. This is the exception to that. You're going to ask a different set of questions and make a determination whether they're even a candidate for a private listing program. If they are, you're going to look at trying to continue to qualify them, as we'll talk about how this program works, and then decide and have them select whether they want to participate in it or not. You're doing this all with an eye of adding value, explaining the strategic nature of participating in something like this, and not alienate them, because if they elect not to do it, you don't want to do it in such a way that they decide, I don't want anything to do with Kevin. He's irritated me so much by continuing to hammer away at what appears to be a benefit to him that I want nothing to do with him. These are the people that will tell you after, if you've tried that in the past, we decided to go a different direction. My wife has a friend who's a real estate agent that she knows from the country club or from school. One of our kids in high school, the mom is a realtor. You'll get all sorts of excuses, just we're basically blowing you off. So market conditions is a big part of this. Being a market expert and practicing how to go through and explain market conditions. If you're not in listing mastery with us, we have a 3-part series that's generally not available We may do something in 2015 where we make it available as a separate series, but being a market expert and actually using the total market overview the way we explain it, and adjusting the explanation and delivering a case for a seller, and we'll talk about this more in session 2, canned MLS reports don't work. Sending somebody a 17-page report that's available to every agent in your market and having them read through it and get the takeaway is not being strategic. You're not going to be successful with taking private listings. You have to be able to explain to them, and this ties into the benefit. Low inventory is a double-edged sword. I spent a lot of time on this because you have to realize they may be scared to death about low inventory. Yeah, it's a positive. They're going to sell very quickly, but if they don't know where they're going to move and there's no prospect for it, they may not be a good candidate for a private listing. Because if the answer to the question about where they're moving to is such that if they went under contract and it wasn't even an option for them, you may have found out the fact that they're going to be a better candidate when there's more plentiful opportunities. Or they may be a candidate for a private listing with a little bit different timing. Because being under contract is not seen as a positive for them, especially over the holidays, because they may have other things going on. Anything you want to add to that before we get into the specifics of the program, Stephanie?
No, just I can't emphasize enough, following up after you, about you have to be the market expert. You have to know that if you're pursuing somebody for this private listing portfolio program, that once they go live, you can sell the house. I mean, you have to know the market backwards and forwards so that when you sit down with them, and again, it's the CMA and the, understanding the total market overview that most of you have in place, because I see you when you're in our private coaching program, but you have got to be the market expert to make sure that you are taking the right listings under this private listing program, right? I mean, you have to.
Okay, good. Well, let's talk a little bit about how the whole system ties together. Some of this, for those of you that are in Listing Mastery or went through Listing Mastery and Listing Mastery Advanced, will recognize pieces of this. We're not going to go through today all in detail because we're going to dissect several of these steps in session 2 and session 3, but I wanted to tie it into a traditional listing process so that you can tie it into what you may be doing if you're following the Listing Mastery system. So prospecting and lead follow-up, that's where all this starts. Could be a past client, could be an expired, withdrawn, or canceled, could be a for sale by owner, it could be almost anything, including geographical or farm calling where you're doing call rounds. Once they enter the system, depending on what their objection is, I want to wait till after the holidays, we're planning on selling in the spring, it's now the spring or the summer, where you call them in April and they say, well, we're thinking about selling in June, or we like to sell, but we don't. I mean, there's any number of ways that it'll present. So we'll talk a little bit today about this, but really in session 2 we're going to dig down hard on this is, what are the most common objections that are a lead-in to the fact that presenting the private listing program as an option, if they qualify for it. So just realize that the Listing Mastery system has a couple of forks in the road. Not everything is one size fits all. This is a great tool for a lot of different objections. It's a great tool for very specific conditions that are short with a determined amount of time. And what I mean by that would be work that's being done to a house. Or they could still sell, but they don't want to be active on the market over the holidays because they're doing a charity event at their house. It's a luxury home and there's all sorts of things going on with the family, and they would certainly be interested in potentially going under contract with a relocation buyer, but not active on the MLS. This is a different way of positioning this. And so once you get through the prospecting and lead follow-up, we're going to get into in session 2 the presentation of the private listing program as an option, if they qualify. I'll talk about the qualifying question today that leads into that so that you can tie it into for session 2. Okay, well, this is what they told me that caused me to close them to come over and see their home and see whether it would be a good candidate to qualify for a private listing. We'll get into a lot of more detail in just in the interest of time in session 2. But you still follow, as you can see here, once you've presented the private listing program as an option, as we'll talk about in session 2, there is still the pre-qualification, the pre-list package, and the listing consultation. These are all typically subsequent presentations. In other words, the difference between a one-step listing where you're going to prospectively follow the listing mastery process is quite often you'll have met with them and gone out and explained and determined and confirmed that a private listing is an appropriate option and they're interested. And then during that, you're doing some of the pre-qualification, gathering additional data. Now you've got a good idea they're going to be a good candidate. Then they get the pre-list package and the listing consultation, because if you do get it out of order, they're going to think you're just coming over to trick them and try and get them to list.
Trick them?
We'll talk about in session 2. Well, because all sorts of agents, especially if they were expired, withdrawn, or canceled, have done all sorts of things. If they were a for sale by owner, they've undoubtedly had agents show up and tell them they just want to come in and look at the property and then try and hammer them on listing. So
right.
the multi-step process is okay. Usually this coincides where you're doing a lot of this. It's during the holidays in the winter where for a lot of us, we're not running the same level of listing consultation appointments. You may be running a lot of these appointments where you then go back and you do a detailed presentation on the market, and you get that listing consultation portion, and you also spend, as we'll talk about in session 3, a lot of time on seller expectations and your seller servicing. Not meaning it takes a long time to do it, but you're setting some good expectations. Because if there's a mismatch here, you may ruin a perfectly good listing that could subsequently go live as a traditional listing, because the seller is thinking they're going to have all sorts of showings or other activity. Even they told you they didn't want showings, they have to understand what's going to happen. And we'll talk a little bit about, from a system standpoint, how you explain what you're doing and answer certain questions. Or if they don't come up, make sure you set certain expectations. One of which would be, we're not going to have a whole bunch of showings like we would if we were active in the MLS. 2 would be, we shouldn't expect multiple offers the first week if that's what's going on in your market because of the differences. Those should be a good aligned match, as we'll talk about in session 2 and 3, with a seller who's a good candidate for this. If you're finding that they're not really happy about certain things, or the expectations of the seller are not a good match, it should be a cautionary thing for you. That you may have somebody that you've inadvertently put into harm's way, thinking they'd be a good private listing candidate, and it's perfectly fine to step away from that and just save them for a later listing. That's why there is a process we'll talk about in session 2 and session 3. And the seller expectations are a big part of that. It's going to be typically a second or later presentation where you're going through the private listing and the pricing, and then where we talk about in listing mastery the seller expectations. This is an even further part of it where you're getting into some of the dialogue. Because whether they bring it up or not, you need to make sure you cover and cross those bridges. Because if they're thinking, whether they say it or not, even though you say, we're going to carefully screen, for example, the buyer agents and the buyers, they have to understand that it's not like a normal active listing in the MLS in terms of showings. That can be turned into a positive for the right sellers. If you're getting pushback, you may find that it's not the case. Now, number 5 here, there are specific listing addendums and paperwork. We'll have a checklist or an outline, including probably a generic example we'll go through in session 2 and 3. But you need to do what's specific for your board and for your state requirements to have a private listing that's not active. So we're not going to profess to try and give you the right language, and this is the only way to do it. The general structuring and the premise is the same, but you have to live within the confines of what the regs are and the activity in your area, what's allowed. So let's go through the final recommendations, and then Stephanie and I are going to get into a little bit of role play and discussions. So recommendations. It's better to take a traditional listing later than push a seller into a private listing if a mismatch exists. I can't stress that enough. There were plenty of people that I started down the path, especially over the 4th quarter of the holidays of the winter, that when I got into it, it just wasn't going to be a good fit. That was fine. It was going to be a good future listing. So don't think that you need to have 90% of your private listing candidates get into the private listing program. It will be a good strategic differentiator just because you've given them that as an option. You're demonstrating through your professionalism in your presentation the fact that you are different than the traditional agents they've been dealing with, including ones in the past. The most important thing is in the private listing program, focusing on practicing the seasonal objections as well as the we're not ready or we're going to sell in the spring or we got work to do in our house. As we'll get into session 2 and 3, again, this is a year-round piece. Being able to customize the response based on what they tell you. What are the conditions they've given you? What are the answers they're giving you? And not have it be a canned presentation. You're going to get a much higher conversion rate. Focus on disqualifying versus inclusion, which is the whole push them into a traditional listing later versus a private listing. There will be plenty of people that you'll be able to get listed in a private listing. Just make sure you pick the right ones, because one inappropriate one can be like handling 10 of the right ones. It can be that big a seller servicing issue, especially if they're hammering you about why there aren't any showings, or they're hammering you about why there's not more activity. Believe me, we bring this up because, as Stephanie knows, we made the mistake only a few times before we figured out that this was a bad thing to do, and it turned into a bad situation. Master tying objections back to market conditions, and I would also add their motivation and timing. They need to buy into market conditions. They don't need to be exempt from it. And if you've gone through our 3-part series on becoming a market expert, you realize that this is a non-traditional way of going through this. Again, like I talked about a few minutes ago, MLS reports that are canned or 17 pages long, and you not being able to go to a summary that is market specific and then their price range specific, and then getting into the comparables that are most appropriate is an abject failure. You will not get any traction because they're going to think they have the upper hand, and whether they said they read that 17-page MLS-generated market report, even if you highlighted page 7, it's not the same. And the private listing needs to be part of your business as well as the alternative choice responses. I'm going to demonstrate an alternative choice both today and then also next week as to how you explain the way you approach this. And it'll be easier when I actually do this live with Stephanie than it is for me to say it. But just doing the canned response where the only result that is what you're trying to accomplish is to meet with them, the alternative choice for what they're telling you about selling in the spring or call me after the holidays is the strategic trick here. So if you have no other takeaway from this, it's something other than a yes or no answer. And it becomes a strategic piece. And the big part, number 5, and before we get into role play, I want to stress this. If you don't buy into this as being something strategic and of value for them, not you, it's going to be really difficult for you to present and close private listing program listings. You have to understand your market conditions so you can explain properly to them why this is a benefit. But if you don't believe it, that there's an advantage for them to do this, you're not going to sell it. If this is just, I need to get a listing so I can put it away, and I'm going to have it and we'll go live in February or March or whenever the time frame is, you're not going to sell very many of them. So, Stephanie, I know you had, based on conversations, based on what you've observed as agents struggling with things, a couple of questions you wanted to ask me in terms of role-playing it, handling the objections, and going through this. So I want to spend the next 15 to 20 minutes in session 1 going through some of those. So what was some of the stuff you wanted to talk about today?
I know that you covered it, but let's cover it again. When do I try to close for an appointment? I've called an old expired. They expired in August. They're not coming back on the market till spring, or let's just say February. when do I close for an appointment? Do I go for an appointment now before Christmas, or do I wait?
Okay. Well, two parts to the answer. I'm glad you brought that up because I don't feel like I was very clear about it. So I'm going to give the 2 or 3 common responses from a prospective seller: expired, withdrawn, and canceled, somebody that's on a call around. It's always the same, especially this time of year. I'll give it to you in the context now, and then next session we'll get into the example of other times other than the holidays.
Okay.
Can you call me back after the holidays? Can you send me some information and follow up with me after the holidays? We're not interested in being on the market during the holidays. We're going to wait and sell in the spring. It's all variants of the same flavor. So one takeaway, and those of you that have been in listing mastery are going to know where I'm going to go with this, is the presumption is that I know, I'm going to make up a hypothetical, where they're moving when they're done. So
Okay.
I'm going to talk about the fact that, just to make it easy and a little simpler, but it would apply in all cases, that Stephanie's going to be moving to Denver and she wants to be there. And the reason she wants me to call after the holidays is because I talked a little bit about by asking her a question. And those of you that have been listing master will know this. If you did sell it and we weren't talking about after the holidays, but you were already in contract, where were you moving when it did sell? And she told me Denver, and now their new time frame is March. So assuming I know all that, I'm going to ask her a question. So with that as a backdrop, I have to know motivation, timing, and as you recall from this, it's customized and it's specific, right? So I'm giving you the background so you realize this is not a read a line off of a script.
Right.
So what I'm going to say is, Stephanie, it's interesting that you bring that up. I make these calls during the holidays all the time. So quite often I hear from people, including people like yourself that are moving out of the area, call me after the holidays. So I guess I have a question for you. And I'm going to be interested in whether or not this even makes any sense for you. Let's say, hypothetically, because you're not, but you were on the market and you were in contract next week. I know the new time frame to get to Denver is March. So let me ask you this. If you were in contract, let's say by December 15th, and you now had to go through the process of the inspections, get through all of the pieces that you need to do, and it was now the end of January and you're ready to close, is that even an option for you and the family at this point, or has everything been reframed around the March timeframe now? So Stephanie's answer to that question is the answer to what she asked me. Do I close her for an appointment? Because what I'm doing is I'm testing her motivation and timing. So if Stephanie said to me, there's absolutely no way we can do this now. We've reset the start date for the job. We've reoriented everything what we're doing. Even if I had a contract on December 15th, I wouldn't be able to accept it because there's no way we can move by January 31st. That is a hard condition, and it's no longer an objection because anything you push is pushing against what's strategic and advantageous for her. So the difference there is it's not about me and me trying to overcome the objection. It's about me asking a specific customized question about would she be able to accept the contract. Again, I'm not talking about being listed. I'm going to the finish line. I'm getting her to future pace and tell me whether or not she could go through the inspections over the holidays, go through the contract process, and be ready to close on January 31st. And for you, on this series, one of the things you're going to look at is she may be a great candidate, and likely is, for a January listing, because I can then follow up with her after the holidays and talk about the time frame. I may choose on the phone to talk a little bit about her timing in March and backing it up to how long she thinks she needs to be on the market, especially if it was a call around and not a previously marketed listing. And I'll back up from a March 31st time frame to where she needs to start. But if the answer to I couldn't even consider entering a contract, not even an option, is I don't close for that appointment. If the answer was we would take a contract. We would love to do that. We could absolutely move to Denver at the end of January instead of March. We just didn't even see that as an option.
Right.
I'm going to then, I'll give you a precursor because we're going to cover this in detail next session. But what I'm going to say to Stephanie then is, I'm not sure whether this would even make sense for you or not, but has anybody explained to you about how a private listing program would work, where you're not active in the MLS, that this might be something where we could get you to Denver sooner than March? And she'll say, no. I tell you what, I'd be willing to spend the time, and again, I'm going to go through this in much more detail next session. I'd be willing to spend the time, we can maybe spend 20, 30 minutes together, and explain how these private listing programs work. If you truly are interested in looking at potentially getting a contract for your home and getting the time frame moved up. I'm not saying it's January 31st, but some time frame sooner than what you're looking at in March. And there are some more nuances. In the interest of time, I'm not going to get into all the objection handlers because more than likely Stephanie's going to ask me some questions. And you need to have 2 or 3 things that you need to be able to address, which we'll get into next week. So did I answer your question the way you wanted me to insofar as I'm not going to give a canned response. It's going to be tied to your motivation and timing. And the way you answer that question is whether or not you close for an appointment.
We get paid to solve problems, don't we?
Well, and solve them when they're solvable. In other words,
Right.
You can't solve a problem that's an advantage for your prospective seller if the answer is no to that question. And all you're doing is alienating them and potentially ruining a future opportunity if you do that. And there's so many traditional coaching programs and training and script trainers and all the nonsense that's discussed on Facebook tell you to just keep hammering away and closing. If Stephanie says no to that question, what good is it for me to use let me send you the list of the 10 reasons why selling during the holidays can be to your advantage. It's not even an option for her. Why would I want to make myself look like a pushy salesperson that doesn't really care about my prospective client's needs? And that's why it has to be customized. That's why as we get into session 2, we get into more of the objection handlers and making sure we set proper expectations. She still may not choose to go into the program, but here's the benefit. If I go spend 20 minutes with her and she says, you know, my husband and I have talked about it, we're not going to participate, that's okay. You're one step closer to getting her listed. And you have an opportunity, as we'll talk about in sessions 2 and 3, to pivot to discussing the time frame for March and how long you need to back that up to start the listing. And you may choose to take it as a traditional listing with a start date of January 15th.
Yep.
She's going to react to you differently, having met you and having you demonstrate that you're a market expert and a professional, than if you were just somebody on the phone. This is why, from a lead follow-up strategy, especially during the holidays in the fourth quarter and over the winter, this is a great way to differentiate yourself. You have something different to talk to them about, as we'll talk about in session 2. So, Stephanie, what else did you have? You had, I think, another question or two that comes up frequently you wanted me to go through.
Well, you covered it. So I had written down, you and I talked this morning, what's different about how you handle objections, that they want to wait until spring or to the holidays than any other time of year. And I think you've covered that because we did use this private listing system methodology to list houses that weren't ready for 30 to 45 days, whether it was June or December. I guess that's more of a question. And just reiterating, because I know you've already covered it, but just cover it one more time. Yes, you can use this all year, but it really comes into play at this time of year. Yes?
Well, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And as you'll see in sessions 2 and 3, it's a little bit of a different objection handler. In other words, what I went through with Stephanie about moving to Denver in March and talking about whether January 31st was even an option, and go back and listen to that a couple times, would be a different variant of what's typically going to be, because you get different objections and conditions. In other words, the way that you preface it and have a discussion for somebody who's doing, maybe they're going to do some remodeling and some make-ready work to the house in June, you have to make it in context with that. It may, your pivot, as we'll talk about in the other session, is it may very well turn into a conversation where the private listing piece comes up during the walkthrough, where you're talking about what kind of work they're going to do to the house. And do they have somebody that's been able to walk through with them and make sure that they're getting the highest return and they don't over-improve? And they'll say, well, what do you mean about that? And you're going to get into the specifics of, for example, quite often you can go beyond the level of return on a kitchen remodel, where you spend excess money on things that the contractor sells you on that you don't get your return on. Are you interested in discussing some of those topics? So instead of pitching the private listing because of the time of year, the fourth quarter of the winter for the people in the spring, if somebody's got great motivation and timing, you may very well ask them when you're in front of them, and they are going to do some work, would you consider selling the house as is if it made sense and you got just as much money out on a net basis? Great. Has anybody talked to you about a private listing? And then you're going to explain to them, and this is why we're going to get into session 2 and session 3, about how this is an all-year strategy. Because having a sign in the yard, especially in a low inventory market, while somebody is doing work, and they get a buyer who says, I don't care what kind of condition the kitchen is, I want this house, and I'll put it in a contract, may be an advantage. This is also an advantage for somebody, as we'll talk about in the next couple of sessions, who says, we would love to sell, we want to sell in the spring, and the reason they're not telling you this, but the reason they want to wait for the spring is there are more houses for them to potentially buy. Again, the side effect of the low inventory market is the fact that they don't know where, and it scares them as to where they're going to move. And in the next couple of sessions, we're going to talk about how to work that time frame in so that that seller who's worried about where they're moving to, again, I made it easy in today's scenario with Stephanie. She's moving to Denver and she wants to be there in March. It's a new job. It makes it less complex. I'm going to go through in the next couple of sessions what happens if Stephanie says, we really, really want to move. We live in this big master plan community and there's like 4,000 homes here and there's 9 for sale. And everything that comes up for sale has an offer the first weekend. We're deathly afraid that if we put our house up on the market, we're going to end up renting and we'd have to move into an apartment. I'm going to explain to you how to talk about the private listing and turn that into a strategic advantage for them so that they can control the process. So the answer to Stephanie's question is, this is so strategic that missing the opportunity, especially in low inventory markets, to turn this into a strategic opportunity for somebody that has nothing to do with the holidays. It's an all year round piece.
Yep.
And we used to do this, as Stephanie mentioned, all year round, because at times it wasn't so much a low inventory issue, but at times there was work being done, but it works equally in both cases. And was there a final question, or was that the last one that you had for today?
No, I just want to say we did this so often it just came natural for us. It was just private listing. And I think about some great examples of some clients that we would do this with. And we had an investor who was our mortgage partner who probably flipped 6 or 8 houses a year with this big crew. And we always took him as a private listing. We put a sign in the yard, like halfway through the remodels, with no real intention of getting the property sold until it went live, but we would have a buyer. This was back in the day when the market was crashing and burning. We would have a buyer for a property when we're halfway done with the project. Now remember, we usually don't work with investors. We always teach our clients no investors, but their average price point was like $200,000. So we were okay. But we use this all the time for our different clients, if you think about it, even from the investor side. And we're going to talk about this in business development tomorrow, about the importance of having, and one of you is on the phone this morning, about the importance of having your affiliates, that you've got these people in your tribe that are carpet people or roof people who are whatever, that you can help somebody who says, no, we have to do work on the property. Hey, great, I have a whole team. You need new carpet, new paint, whatever. I'm going to just touch this. This is how you succeed in the private listing portfolio, is if they have work to be done that you satisfy, you solve their problem with your tribe. That they have to have work done, or, depending on what part of the country that you're in.
Well, and that's why it's customized. That's why you can't just say, let me give you the top 10 reasons why it's important to be on the market over the holidays, or let me send you a tool, a document about what the benefits are of being on the market over the holidays. Stephanie, moving to Denver, doesn't care about that. Because if the answer to the question was no, not even an option for us, go back and listen to that and now think about, God, how many people was I potentially trying to run over with a script who had a answer of a no to that question that didn't come out till later? Or you never discovered it, they listed it with somebody else because you irritated them, and you became the unprofessional, like everybody else, pushy agent. And they went and picked an inferior agent because you inadvertently tried to run over somebody by not having it be customized in the sense that you adjust it for seasonality, you adjust it for market conditions, and you adjust it based on what that client, the prospective seller, looking to accomplish. So hope you got a lot out of session 1. We're going to wrap up now, and we'll be back with session 2, and we're going to dive deeper into the way the system works. We're going to take off from where I asked that question today to, okay, now I'm going to potentially go out and see somebody because they did agree to meet with me. I still don't know whether they're going to elect to participate in a private listing, and again, I don't really care. I'd like them to, but if they choose not to, I've still got them in my pipeline, and I'm one step closer to getting them listed in a traditional listing. So that's why this is a 3-part series. If we just told you, hey, go out and say this and take a listing, for the reason that we just talked about running over conditions and irritating clients, there are some nuances to this, and I want you to hear this. Most of what we're going to cover in session 2 and session 3 are things that we either screwed up once or more than once, or it was so bad that at times we would look at each other and say, are we sure we want to do this? So all of the gotchas and the problems are what we cover in session 2 and session 3, and share with you the wisdom we got from making mistakes. And this is not easy. If it was easy, we could have sent you a form and said, say the following 3 things and have an addendum that looks like this, and you're all set. Right. And we've had people try and co-opt what we were doing in our market, or co-opt what we're doing because they've heard us talk about this. And usually they don't get great results, do they, Stephanie? They end up coming back and going, it doesn't work, or I'm not going to do this, there's too many problems with it. That's why this is a 3-part series, because we're going to get into the meat of all the gotchas and how to overcome the most common mistakes, and especially session 3, but the next 2 sessions.
Yep. Hey, great session today, Kevin. Thanks so much. And then just so you all know, for those of you who are here with us this morning, we're meeting tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. Central Standard Time to cover the business planning and development clinic. So glad to see you here this morning. We'll see you on Tuesday, and we've got you for the next 3 weeks, same time, same station. So glad you're here.
All right, perfect. Thanks.
Bye.